The steady tick of a grandfather clock fills the air of McKinney's saloon. Through grimy windows, the setting sun paints long shadows across weathered floorboards. In the corner, an old man in a faded duster coat sits alone, nursing a glass of water. His calloused hands, marked by decades of work, rest quietly on the table. Nothing about him suggests danger, and that's exactly how Marcus Thorne prefers it these days. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Silverpine wasn't much of a town anymore. What had once been a bustling silver mining community had dwindled to little more than a handful of buildings clutching desperately to the edge of the painted desert. The silver had run dry 15 years ago, taking with it the dreams of fortune seekers and leaving behind only those too stubborn or too rooted to leave. But for Marcus Thorne, it was perfect. No one here knew about El Coyote, the legend who could draw and fire before most men could blink. No one remembered the gunfighter who'd cleaned out the Thompson gang in '82, or the man who'd outdrawn 7 bounty hunters in the streets of Santa Fe. Here, he was just old Marcus, the quiet fellow who helped fix machinery at Jenkins Mill and occasionally played chess with Doc Wallace on Sunday afternoons. 17 years of peace had softened his appearance, if not his reflexes. His once black hair had turned silver, matching the stubble on his weathered face. The crow's feet around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting into the desert sun, and his clothes were those of a working man, simple, practical, with no hint of the elegance he'd once affected in his gunfighting days. The legendary gun belt that had once rode low on his hip now rested in an old trunk beneath his bed, wrapped in oilcloth and memories. His hands, though lined with age, still maintained their strength. A fact he kept to himself, just like the daily exercises he performed in the privacy of his small house on the edge of town. The regulars at McKinney's had learned to let him be with his thoughts and his water glass. Even old Pete, the town drunk who'd talk the ear off a fence post, knew better than to disturb Marcus during his afternoon ritual. There was something in the way the old man carried himself, something in his eyes that hinted at depths best left unplumbed. "Another water, Mr. Thorne?" Sarah McKinney's voice cut through his reverie. The saloon keeper's daughter, barely 20, had a kind smile that reminded Marcus of his own girl, long grown and living back east with her mother. Sarah was one of the few bright spots in Silverpine, managing the saloon, while her father slowly succumbed to consumption in the back room. "Much obliged, Sarah," he nodded, sliding his empty glass across the worn table. He'd watched her grow from a pigtailed child into a capable young woman, and sometimes caught himself wondering if his own daughter had turned out half as well. The familiar routine of afternoon quiet was suddenly interrupted by the jangle of spurs and loud voices from the street. Through the window, Marcus watched as 3 riders pulled up outside. Their horses were good stock, too good for regular cowboys, and their clothes were trail-worn but expensive. The way they carried themselves, all swagger and barely contained violence, told him everything he needed to know. The leader's duster was stained with the red dust of the painted desert, but the pearl-handled revolvers at his hips gleamed with recent care. Trouble had finally found Silverpine. The saloon door swung open, bringing with them a blast of hot desert air and the smell of dust. The 3 men swaggered in, spurs jingling against the wooden floor. The leader, a tall man with a scarred face and a black hat, surveyed the near-empty room with cold eyes. Marcus recognized the look. He'd seen it in 100 saloon mirrors years ago. These were men who lived by the gun and enjoyed it. "Well, ain't this a sorry excuse for a saloon?" he drawled, his voice carrying the rough edge of someone used to being obeyed. "Where's the owner?" Sarah stepped forward, her chin held high despite the tremor Marcus could see in her hands. "My father's away on business. I'm managing things until he returns." The scarred man's lips curled into an unpleasant smile. "That's so? Pretty little thing like you running a place like this? Ain't that just interesting?" His companions chuckled, spreading out across the room with the practiced efficiency of wolves cornering prey. Marcus watched them carefully, noting how their gun belts rode low, the mark of men who used them often. The leader's right hand never strayed far from his holster, and the calluses on his trigger finger were visible even from across the room. These weren't common bandits. They were killers who'd found a quiet town far from the law. "We'll need rooms," the scarred man continued, leaning against the bar. "And information. Word is an old friend of ours passed through here a while back. Fellow named Carson. Ring any bells?" Sarah shook her head, her voice steady despite her fear. "I'm sorry, but we don't have any rooms available at present, and I don't know anyone by that name." The leader's smile vanished like morning dew under a harsh sun. "Now, that's not very hospitable. Maybe we ain't making ourselves clear enough." His hand drifted closer to his gun. When the Hawkins brothers ask for something, smart folks tend to be real accommodating. Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The Hawkins brothers, he knew the name. 3 years ago, they'd carved a bloody path through New Mexico territory, robbing banks and leaving dead lawmen in their wake. He'd read about them in the newspaper, grateful those days were behind him. But now here they were, bringing their particular brand of violence to his quiet corner of the world. Marcus watched as Sarah's face paled, saw the youngest Hawkins brother's hand creeping toward his gun, and felt 17 years of peace beginning to crack like sun-baked earth before a storm. In the corner, the grandfather clock continued its steady tick, counting down to a moment Marcus had prayed would never come again. His right hand, resting on the table, twitched ever so slightly, muscle memory that no amount of years could erase. Time seemed to slow as he realized that his peaceful life in Silverpine was about to change forever, all because 3 dangerous men had walked into the wrong saloon on the wrong afternoon. The only question was, how long could Marcus Thorne keep his past buried before it clawed its way back to the surface? Marcus watched as the youngest Hawkins brother, couldn't be more than 25, with a face unmarked by the desert sun that had weathered his older siblings, knocked over a chair deliberately, testing for a reaction. The sound echoed through the saloon like a gunshot, making Sarah jump. Old Pete had already slipped out the back door, his half-finished whiskey still sweating rings onto the bar top. The old drunk might not have much sense left, but he could still smell trouble brewing. Now it was just Marcus, Sarah, and the 3 brothers in the growing tension of the afternoon heat. "You know what I think?" The scarred leader, Hawkins himself, pushed away from the bar, spurs jangling with each deliberate step. His duster swept behind him like a gunfighter's cape, and Marcus noted how the man's left hand tapped against his leg in a rhythm that spoke of barely contained violence. "I think maybe this town's been lying to itself, thinking it's too small, too quiet for anybody to notice." He ran a finger along the bar top, examining the dust with exaggerated concern. "But everything's got value, doesn't it? Even a dried-up mining town like this one." The middle brother, a red-headed man with a face like a ferret and eyes that couldn't seem to settle on anything for more than a moment, laughed. "Ain't that the truth, Luke? Even got themselves a pretty little bartender." He leered at Sarah, who took an involuntary step back, bumping into the shelf of bottles behind her. The gentle clinking of glass seemed to echo through the room like distant wind chimes. Marcus felt something stirring in his chest, something he'd buried 17 years ago along with his gun belt and his reputation. He recognized the feeling. It was the same cold clarity that used to settle over him before a fight, when the world would narrow down to angles and distances, when every movement became a calculation of speed against time. His fingers, resting on the table, began to drum a slow rhythm, an old tell he thought he'd conquered. In his mind's eye, he could see his gun belt, wrapped in that oilcloth, lying in the trunk just 5 minutes' walk from here. 5 minutes might as well be 5 years if things went bad. "Now then," Luke Hawkins continued, reaching the middle of the room. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots, boards that had seen their share of blood and broken men over the years. "About those rooms, I'm thinking you might want to reconsider your position, miss. We're planning to stay a while, get to know the locals." His hand settled on his gun belt, thumb hooking over the elaborately tooled leather. "Make some friends." Sarah's voice trembled slightly, but she stood her ground. Marcus had seen that same steel in her mother's eyes years ago before the fever took her. As I said, we have no rooms available. The mining company representatives took them all last week. It was a lie. The mining company hadn't sent anyone in months, but Marcus had to admire her quick thinking. Mining company? The youngest Hawkins snorted, kicking aside another chair as he paced. In this ghost town? Ain't been nothing worth digging up here since before the war. Amalgamated Silver, Sarah continued, warming to her story. Her hands were steady now as she wiped down the bar, a picture of casual confidence that only someone like Marcus, who'd spent years reading people's tells, would know was forced. They're investigating reopening the Black Hawk mine. There's been talk of new veins discovered deeper in the mountain. Modern equipment can reach places the old-timers couldn't. Marcus noticed how Luke's eyes narrowed at this information. A ghost of a smile played across the gunman's scarred face, pulling at the white line that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. Is that so? Well, ain't that interesting news? He turned to his brothers. Boys, I'm thinking Silver Pine might be more entertaining than we expected. The middle brother, the redhead who'd introduced himself with a leer rather than a name, moved closer to Sarah. His spurs marked each step with a predatory musical note. Maybe we ought to introduce ourselves proper to these fine mining gentlemen when they return. Wouldn't want them thinking we're unfriendly. Marcus could read their intentions as clearly as a story in the newspaper. They'd wait for the supposed mining men to return, ambush them, take whatever they were carrying. When no mining men showed up, they'd turn their frustrations on the town. He'd seen it happen before, back in his other life. Sometimes he'd been the one to stop it. Sometimes he'd been too late, arriving to find only cooling bodies and grieving families. The pattern was as familiar as an old song. First comes the threat, then the waiting, then the violence. Always the violence. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting bars of light across the floor like prison cell shadows. In one of those bars, Marcus caught sight of his own shadow, stretched long and thin. For a moment it looked like the shadow he used to cast back when his gun belt rode low and men spoke his name in whispers, back when being El Coyote meant something more than just an old story told around campfires. Mister? Luke Hawkins had finally noticed him, sitting quietly in his corner. The gunman's eyes were the color of winter sky, cold and promising storm. You're awful interested in our conversation over there. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus kept his voice mild, his posture relaxed. Years of practice had taught him how to look harmless, how to be the old man everyone overlooked. Just enjoying my water is all. Water? The youngest brother laughed, the sound sharp and mean as a knife blade. In a saloon? What kind of man drinks water in a saloon? A careful one, Marcus replied, maintaining eye contact with Luke. He saw something flicker in the gunman's eyes. Recognition, maybe, or just the instinct that comes from years of sizing up potential threats. It was the look of a wolf catching an unfamiliar scent on the wind. Luke stepped closer, his spurs marking each step with a silver note. The other patrons had cleared out by now, leaving the saloon feeling bigger and emptier than before. You got a name, old-timer. Marcus Thorne. Thorne? Luke rolled the name around his mouth like a sip of whiskey. Don't recall hearing that name before. Have you been in Silver Pine long? Long enough. The middle brother had edged away from Sarah now, attention drawn by the quiet tension building between his older brother and the old man in the corner. Marcus could feel the situation balancing on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one wrong move, and 17 years of peace would shatter like a mirror under a bullet. You know what I think? Luke's hand drifted closer to his gun, fingers flexing like a pianist before a performance. I think maybe you ought to find somewhere else to enjoy your water. Streets are gonna get mighty dangerous around here, and it would be a shame if anything happened to a peaceful fellow like yourself. Marcus felt time slow down, felt the weight of the moment pressing against him like a strong wind. He had a choice to make. He could walk away, head home, dig out his gun belt, and prepare for what was coming. The smart play, the careful play, the play that might save his life but cost him something more precious, the ability to look himself in the mirror tomorrow morning. Or he could end this now before it began, before anyone else got hurt, before Sarah had to learn the hard lessons he'd spent a lifetime trying to forget. His hands remained still on the table, but in his mind they were already moving, already feeling the familiar weight of his revolver. 17 years was a long time, but some things you never forget. Some skills stay in your bones, waiting for the moment they're needed again, like a language you learned as a child or the memory of your first love smile. The grandfather clock ticked in the corner, marking seconds that stretched like years. Marcus looked at Sarah, saw the fear in her eyes, and made his decision. Whatever came next would change everything. But then, that's what decisions were for. Maybe, he said softly, each word carrying the weight of a bullet. It's not my safety you should be worried about. Luke Hawkins's smile froze on his face, then slowly melted away like snow in desert sun. The scarred gunman took another step forward, boot heels striking the floorboards with deliberate force. Behind him, his brother spread out instinctively, falling into a triangle formation that spoke of years of practice. The youngest shifted left, while the redhead drifted right, their movements as natural as wolves circling prey. Late afternoon light caught the silver conchos on their gun belts, sending tiny flashes across the room like summer lightning. That almost sounded like a threat, old-timer. Luke's voice had dropped an octave, carrying the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Surely a peaceful fellow like yourself wouldn't be threatening anybody. Not in a nice, quiet town like this. Marcus hadn't moved from his chair, hadn't so much as lifted his water glass. But something had changed in the way he held himself, a subtle shift that Sarah noticed from behind the bar. The stoop in his shoulders had vanished, replaced by the kind of stillness that comes only from complete control. His eyes, usually soft with age and memory, had taken on a harder cast, like river stones polished by years of dangerous currents. Just making an observation, Marcus replied, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent room, bouncing off the tin ceiling tiles that had witnessed countless confrontations over the years. About safety, about choices, about how some men don't know when they're pushing their luck, about how some decisions can't be unmade. The youngest Hawkins brother laughed, but there was an edge of uncertainty to it now, like a man testing ice he's not sure will hold his weight. Listen to this old fool, Luke, talking like he's somebody, like he's got any say in what happens here. Somebody? Marcus's lips curved in what might have been a smile, though it never reached his eyes. No, I'm nobody special. Just a man who's lived long enough to recognize trouble when it walks through the door. He paused, letting his gaze drift to each brother in turn, noting how the redhead's trigger finger twitched against his holster, how the youngest kept shifting his weight from foot to foot. And long enough to know what happens next if that person trouble doesn't walk right back out. Sarah watched the exchange with growing tension, her hands gripping the edge of the bar until her knuckles whitened. She'd known Marcus Thorne for 5 years, seen him fix machinery with hands that never seemed to shake, play chess with the doctor on lazy Sunday afternoons, help repair the church roof after the big storm last winter. But she'd never heard him speak like this, never seen this steel-spined stranger wearing her friend's familiar face. It was like watching a mask slip, revealing something dangerous underneath. Luke's hand had drifted closer to his gun, fingers flexing like a card sharp before the deal. A bead of sweat traced the scar on his face, despite the cooling air. You know what I think, Mr. Thorne. I think maybe you've been out in the sun too long, making you say things you might regret. Things that might have consequences. The sun's been good to me, Marcus replied, his voice carrying the kind of patience that comes from the long practice. Shows me things clear as day, like how your left boot heel worn down more than your right, means you pivot on it when you draw, Or how your younger brother there can't seem to keep his gun hand still. Sign of a man who's eager but ain't quite sure of himself yet. Or how the redhead keeps looking at you before he moves. Means he's quick, but he doesn't trust his own judgment. The red-headed brother's eyes widened slightly, hand jerking away from his gun like it had suddenly grown hot. Luke. I see it. Luke cut him off, his voice sharp as a razor. His pale eyes hadn't left Marcus, studying him with the intensity of a man trying to recall something just out of reach. You seem to know an awful lot about gunfighting for a peaceful man, Mr. Thorne. More than most men learn just from watching. You'd be surprised at what you learn, watching people come and go through a town like this. Marcus's fingers had stopped their drumming, settling into an unnatural stillness that seemed to draw all eyes in the room. 17 years I've sat in this corner, seen all kinds pass through, some looking for trouble, some running from it. Some think they're the fastest guns around right up until they meet somebody faster. Sometimes they learn from the meeting. Sometimes they don't learn anything ever again. A whisper of memory stirred in Luke's eyes. 17 years, he repeated slowly, testing each syllable like a man searching for poison in his food. That would be right around the time El Coyote disappeared. Right after that business in Santa Fe with the Martinez brothers. Sarah's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room. Everyone in the territory had heard of El Coyote, the legendary gunfighter who'd vanished without a trace after the bloody showdown in Santa Fe. Some said he'd been killed, others that he'd grown tired of the killing and walked away. The stories varied, but they all agreed on one thing. He'd been the fastest gun anyone had ever seen. El Coyote's just a story now, Marcus said quietly, his words falling into the silence like stones into a deep well. Like most things from those days. Just tales people tell around campfires to scare their children straight. Maybe. Luke's scarred face had taken on a predatory intensity, like a hunting cat that's caught an interesting scent. Or maybe he just got old, started drinking water instead of whiskey, found himself a quiet corner in a quiet town. His hand settled on his gun belt, thumb hooking over the tooled leather. Would be quite a thing, wouldn't it? Finding out El Coyote's been hiding right here in Silver Pine all this time. Marcus's next words carried across the room like smoke over still water. Might be an even bigger thing finding out why he chose to disappear in the first place. Why might a man walk away from a reputation like that, only to surface again when three brothers ride into town looking for trouble? The youngest Hawkins brother's hand had drifted to his gun now, but there was sweat visible on his forehead despite the cooling air. The redhead had backed up another step, his ferret-like face darting between his older brother and the seated figure, trying to calculate odds that suddenly seemed less certain. Could be we're about to find out, Luke said, his voice soft but carrying an edge sharp enough to draw blood. Unless you're planning to handle this with just words, old-timer. Words can be enough, Marcus replied. If a man's smart enough to hear what they're really saying. He lifted his water glass, took a slow sip, set it down with deliberate care. Each movement was measured, precise, like a man who'd never needed to hurry because waiting was part of his strength. Question is, are you that smart, Mr. Hawkins? The grandfather clock ticked away the seconds, each sound like a hammer falling on steel. Through the windows the sun had sunk lower, painting the saloon in shades of amber and shadow. In those shadows, murder waited with practiced patience, balanced on the knife edge between warning and war. Sarah watched it all, her heart hammering against her ribs, seeing her quiet town balanced on the precipice of violence. And in the middle of it all, sat Marcus Thorne, still as death itself, his eyes carrying the weight of 17 years of secrets about to come undone. The saloon's batwing doors creaked open, drawing every eye except Marcus's. Sheriff Tom Wheeler stood framed in the doorway, his badge catching the late afternoon light. He was a young man, barely 30, who'd taken the job because nobody else wanted it. His gun belt was new, the leather still stiff, and his stance spoke more of uncertainty than authority. Everything all right here? Wheeler's hand rested nervously on his holster, eyes darting between the Hawkins brothers and Marcus. Old Pete came running into my office, talking about trouble. Luke Hawkins straightened slowly, though his eyes never left Marcus. "No trouble, Sheriff, just having a friendly conversation with Mr. Thorne here about the old days. Ain't that right?" "The old days," Marcus repeated softly. "They have a way of catching up to a man, don't they, Sheriff? Like unpaid debts." Wheeler shifted uncomfortably, aware he'd stepped into something he didn't fully understand. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, and he could feel the weight of years' worth of history pressing down on the moment. "Mr. Thorne's been telling us some interesting stories," the youngest Hawkins brother said, trying to inject lightness into his voice but failing. "About El Coyote. Have you ever heard those stories, Sheriff?" Wheeler's face paled slightly. Like everyone else in the territory, he knew the tales. "Those are old stories, best left in the past where they belong." "The past," Luke mused, his scarred face thoughtful. "Funny thing about the past, sometimes it's sitting right in front of you drinking water in a saloon corner." He turned to Wheeler, his voice taking on an official tone. "Tell me, Sheriff, how long has Mr. Thorne here been in your town?" 17 years. Sarah answered from behind the bar, her voice steady despite her fear. "Since before I was born? He's a good man, never caused any trouble." 17 years, Luke repeated, savoring the words. "And in all that time, has anyone ever seen him draw a gun? Ever seen him wear a gun belt? Ever wondered why a man who knows so much about gunfighting chooses to live such a peaceful life?" Wheeler's eyes narrowed, really looking at Marcus for perhaps the first time since taking office. The old man hadn't moved from his chair, hadn't changed his relaxed posture, but something was different. The sheriff had seen his share of dangerous men in his short career, learned to recognize the signs. Now, looking at Marcus Thorne, he saw what he'd been missing all these years. "Mr. Thorne," Wheeler said carefully, "maybe you ought to come down to my office for your own protection." A ghost of a smile touched Marcus's lips. "Appreciate the offer, Sheriff, but I reckon I'll stay right here. Sometimes a man has to face what's coming, even if he'd rather not." "Face what's coming?" The red-headed Hawkins brother's voice cracked slightly. "Luke, maybe we ought to—" "Quiet," Luke snapped, his face hardening. "Mr. Thorne here's been suggesting we leave town. Says it ain't safe for us to stay." His hand hadn't moved from his gun belt. "But I'm thinking maybe it ain't safe for him. Man his age living with secrets like that. Might be time those secrets came to light." Sarah stepped out from behind the bar, her father's stubborn courage showing in her stance. "Leave him alone. Whatever you think you know, whatever you're planning, just leave him be." "Brave girl," Luke said without looking at her. "But this ain't about you. This is about legend and truth. About whether El Coyote really died in Santa Fe or if he just got tired. About whether a man can really change his nature or if it just goes to sleep for a while, waiting to wake up." Marcus's voice cut through the tension like a well-honed blade. "You seem awful interested in El Coyote, Mr. Hawkins. Any particular reason?" Something dark flickered across Luke's scarred face. "Maybe I knew some of the men he killed. Maybe I've spent years wondering about the man who put this mark on my face back when I was just starting out. The man who shot the gun out of my hand and left me alive, but made sure I'd never draw as fast again." Understanding dawned in Marcus's eyes. "The boy from the Carson gang, I remember now, you were riding with them when they tried to rob the bank in Tucson." "Wasn't much more than a kid," Luke agreed, his voice tight with old pain. "Just 16. You shot my gun hand, sent the bullet right through the webbing between thumb and finger. Ruined my draw forever. But you let me live. Let me watch as you killed the others." Wheeler's hand tightened on his gun. "Now hold on. Stay out of this, Sheriff," Luke warned, never taking his eyes off Marcus. "This is between me and him. 17 years I've been looking. 17 years of hearing stories, following rumors, always a step behind. And here you are, hiding in plain sight, drinking water in a two-bit saloon." The grandfather clock struck the hour, each chime falling into the silence like stones into a deep well. Outside, the sun had sunk lower, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. A warm breeze stirred the dust in the street, carrying with it the promise of violence as old as the territory itself. Marcus set his water glass down for what might be the last time. 17 years is a long time to carry a grudge, boy. Long enough to learn better. Long enough to get good with my left hand? Luke replied softly. Long enough to make sure when I found you it'd end differently this time. The saloon had grown darker as the sun continued its descent, shadows pooling in the corners like spilled ink. Sheriff Wheeler stood frozen between duty and wisdom, his new badge suddenly feeling as heavy as a gravestone on his chest. Sarah had backed away from the bar, her hands pressed against her mouth, watching the scene unfold like a nightmare, made real. Left hand, Marcus mused, his voice carrying the kind of calm that comes just before a lightning strike. That's why I didn't recognize your draw stance earlier. You've adapted, changed your style. There was almost a note of approval in his voice, the gunfighter's appreciation for technique rising above personal feelings. Luke's scarred face twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. Had to. After what you did, had to learn everything all over again. Different grip, different holster, different way of thinking about the draw. His left hand hovered near his gun, fingers spread like a pianist about to strike a deadly chord. Spent years practicing, thousands of hours, until I could do this. The movement was so fast it seemed to blur the air. Luke's left hand whipped down and up again, his gun appearing as if by magic, aimed steady at Marcus's chest. The younger brothers let out low whistles of appreciation, but Marcus hadn't moved, hadn't even blinked. Fast, the old gunfighter acknowledged. Smooth transition from the draw to the aim. You've done the work. Faster than you now, old man, Luke said, but there was a question in his voice, a hint of uncertainty that his brothers might have missed, but Marcus caught clearly. Had to be. Had to know that when I found you, I'd be ready. Sheriff Wheeler's hand had drifted toward his own gun, but Marcus stopped him with a slight shake of his head. Best stay out of this, Sheriff. Man's got a right to settle his debts. Debts? Luke's voice cracked like a whip. Is that what you call it? You killed my friends, destroyed my gun hand, left me with this reminder. He gestured to the scar with his free hand. All because we were trying to make our way in the world. Your way? Marcus's eyes hardened for the first time. You were robbing that bank in Tucson. Shot the teller, a boy of 15, because he wasn't moving fast enough. Then started shooting into the crowd when the marshal showed up. That's the way you were making the world? The youngest Hawkins brother shifted uncomfortably. Luke, you never said, shut up. Luke's gun hand trembled slightly before steadying. You don't get to judge me, old man, not after what you did, not after hiding out here pretending to be something you're not. El Coyote, the famous gunfighter with a conscience, the man who only killed bad men. He spat the words like poison. Tell me, how many men did you kill before you found your conscience? How many didn't deserve it? A shadow passed across Marcus's face, brief but deep as a canyon. Too many, he admitted quietly. That's why I stopped. Why I walked away. Some debts can't be paid with more killing. Sarah's voice cut through the tension. Marcus, is it true? Were you really El Coyote? Marcus's eyes never left Luke's gun. Yes, though not for a long time now. Not since Santa Fe. Not since I realized what I was becoming. What are you becoming? Luke's laugh was sharp as broken glass. You were becoming a legend. The fastest gun in the territory. The man who could draw and fire before most men could blink. And you threw it away to become what? A mill worker, a chess player, a peaceful old man drinking water in a corner? I became what I chose to be, Marcus replied, his voice carrying the weight of 17 years of certainty. Same as you chose what you became. The difference is, I chose to stop. The red-headed brother had backed all the way to the wall now, his ferret-like face darting between his older brother and the seated gunfighter. The youngest had his hand on his gun but seemed unsure whether to draw it, aware that any sudden movement might spark an explosion. "Well, your choice is about to catch up with you." Luke's left hand tightened on his gun. "Get up, nice and slow. We're going to walk out into the street and we're going to finish what you started in Tucson. Man to man. Unless you're too old and peaceful to strap on a gun anymore." Marcus sat very still, 17 years of peace hanging in the balance. When he spoke, his voice was soft but carried to every corner of the room. "I buried my gun belt for a reason, Mr. Hawkins. Buried it with the man I used to be. You really want to dig all that up?" "Dig it up or I'll shoot you where you sit," Luke snarled. "Your choice, old man. Die like a coward or die like El Coyote." The grandfather clock ticked away the seconds, each sound like a nail being driven into Hope's coffin. Sheriff Wheeler looked desperately between the two men, knowing he should do something but equally certain that any intervention would only make things worse. Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears, seeing her friend balanced between the man he'd chosen to be and the man he'd once been. Finally, Marcus nodded, the movement so slight it was barely perceptible. "Sarah," he said, his voice gentle as falling snow. "In my house, under the bed, there's an old trunk. The key's on a leather string in the top drawer of my desk. Would you fetch it for me?" Sarah hesitated only a moment before nodding and hurrying toward the door. As she passed him, Marcus spoke again, his words carrying the weight of both apology and farewell. "I'm sorry you have to see this. Sorry to bring this violence to your door, but sometimes the past won't stay buried no matter how deep you put it." The minutes stretched like years as they waited for Sarah's return. Luke kept his gun trained steadily on Marcus, while his brothers maintained their positions, creating a triangle of threat around the seated man. Outside, the street had grown quiet, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Sheriff Wheeler cleared his throat. "Maybe there's another way to settle this." "There isn't," Luke cut him off, never taking his eyes off Marcus. "Been too many years, too many miles. Man kills your friends, ruins your gun hand, leaves you with a face that makes children cry. That ain't the kind of debt that gets settled with words." Marcus sat perfectly still, but his mind was racing through memories of another life. The weight of his gun belt across his hips, the smell of gun oil and leather, the way time seemed to slow down in those crucial moments before a fight. 17 years of peace had softened his appearance but hadn't dulled those memories. They were still sharp as razor wire in his mind. "Your friends," Marcus said quietly, "were killing innocent people. The teller in Tucson wasn't their first victim. I'd been tracking the Carson gang for 3 months before that day. Found the bodies they left behind. Men, women, didn't seem to matter to them." Luke's scarred face twisted. "We were at war with the world, taking what we deserved." "What did you deserve?" For the first time, real anger crept into Marcus's voice. "That teller, Billy Matthews was his name. He had a sister, Emma. She was saving up to send him to school back east, had dreams of him becoming a doctor." His eyes locked onto Luke's. "She was there that day. Watched her brother die because you were taking what you deserved." The youngest Hawkins brother shifted uncomfortably. "Luke, you never told us, because it don't matter." Luke's voice cracked like a whip. "Past is past. What matters is here and now. What matters is El Coyote thinking he could bury his sins under 17 years of playing peaceful." Quick footsteps on the wooden walkway outside announced Sarah's return. She burst through the doors, clutching an old trunk to her chest, her face flushed from running. The key dangled from her fingers on its leather string. "Set it down," Marcus instructed gently. "Over here, where I can reach it." Sarah placed the trunk beside his chair, her hands trembling slightly. "Marcus, please. You don't have to do this." He smiled at her, a genuine smile that carried all the warmth of their years of friendship. "Some things a man has to do, Sarah." Some debts need paying, one way or another. His eyes moved to the trunk, though I suspect this payment has been coming due for a long time now. The trunk was simple pine, darkened with age and handling. The brass key slid into the lock with a sound like fate turning a corner. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth that had protected it through 17 years of voluntary exile, lay a gun belt that seemed to draw all the light in the room to its worn leather and gleaming steel. Well, well, Luke breathed, a hint of anticipation creeping into his voice. The famous rig itself. They said El Coyote's gun belt was custom-made by a Mexican craftsman who worked on it for a month. Said the holster was designed to ride at just the right angle for the fastest draw anyone had ever seen. Marcus's hands hovered over the cloth-wrapped bundle. His name was Eduardo Vargas, lived outside Santa Fe, spent his life making beautiful things, until the Carson gang killed him and his family for the silver conchos on a gun belt they fancied. His eyes met Luke's. Another debt that got paid in Tucson. The red-headed brother had gone pale. Luke, maybe this ain't such a good idea. If he really is El Coyote... Shut up. Luke's gun hand had started to tremble slightly. He's just an old man now. Whatever he used to be, time catches up with everyone. Marcus lifted the gun belt from its resting place, the familiar weight settling into his hands like a long-lost friend. The cloth fell away, revealing tooled leather dark with age but still supple, steel fittings gleaming dully in the fading light. The Colt rode in its holster like it had been born there, its ivory grips yellowed but smooth from years of use. Sarah watched with a mixture of fascination and horror as her friend, the quiet man who'd fixed her father's machinery, who'd taught her to play chess, who'd always had a kind word and a gentle smile, transformed before her eyes. Just holding the gun belt seemed to change him, straightening his spine, squaring his shoulders, turning back the years like pages in a book. "Last chance," Marcus said softly, his hands running over the leather with practiced familiarity. "Walk away, Mr. Hawkins. Take your brothers and ride out. Let the past stay buried." Luke's laugh was sharp and bitter as winter wind. "You know I can't do that, not now. Not after all these years." "No," Marcus sighed, rising slowly from his chair. "I don't suppose you can." His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as he buckled on the gun belt. The weight settled across his hips like a sentence being passed. "Sheriff, you'll want to clear the street. And Sarah." He turned to her, his eyes soft with regret. "You should go to your father now. Some things aren't meant to be witnessed." The grandfather clock ticked away the moments, each sound marking time's steady march toward violence. Outside, the sun had touched the horizon, painting the world in shades of gold and shadow. Soon it would be dark, but not before old debts were paid, in the currency of lead and blood. Marcus Thorne stood straight and tall, 17 years of peace falling away like autumn leaves in a storm. In his place stood El Coyote, the legend that had never quite died, the ghost that had waited patiently in that trunk for the day when it would be needed again. The street emptied like a river running backward, leaving nothing but dust devils dancing in the last rays of sunlight. Word had spread through Silver Pine faster than summer lightning. El Coyote was strapping on his gun again. Shutters closed, doors locked, and parents hurried their children inside, leaving the street as empty as a church on Saturday night. Sheriff Wheeler stood on the boardwalk outside the saloon, torn between duty and common sense. "Mr. Thorne, Marcus, as the law in this town, I can't just—" "You can and you will, Sheriff." Marcus cut him off, his voice carrying the kind of authority Wheeler's badge had always aspired to, but never quite achieved. "This started before your time, and it'll end the same way. Some things the law can't touch." Luke Hawkins had backed out onto the street, his left-handed draw position perfect, gun still trained on Marcus. His brothers flanked him, their own weapons now drawn, but their hands were shaking. They'd heard the stories of El Coyote all their lives. Everyone had. But seeing the legend come to life before their eyes was something else entirely. 17 years, Luke called out, his voice carrying across the empty street. 17 years I've dreamed about this moment, practiced for it, lived for it. Marcus stepped out of the saloon, the setting sun casting his shadow long and dark across the packed earth. The gun belt rode naturally on his hips, as if the 17 years without it had been the aberration. His hands hung loose at his sides, ready but not tense. 17 years is a long time to waste on hate, he replied, his boots raising small puffs of dust as he moved. Could have built something in all those years. Could have become something more than just another man with a gun. Built something? Luke's laugh was bitter as poison. With this hand? He raised his right hand, revealing the twisted scar tissue between thumb and forefinger. With this face? You took my choices away that day in Tucson. Left me with nothing but revenge. From the saloon doorway, Sarah watched the scene unfold with her heart in her throat. The Marcus she knew, quiet, gentle, always ready with a kind word, seemed to have vanished. In his place stood a stranger who wore familiar features, but moved like a hunting cat, each step measured and deadly with purpose. I gave you a choice that day, Marcus said, stopping 20 paces from Luke. Could have killed you like I did the others. Instead, I took away your gun hand, gave you a chance to walk a different path. His eyes were hard as desert stones. Not my fault you chose to walk it left-handed instead of straight. The youngest Hawkins brother's gun wavered. Luke, maybe we should take one step toward your horse, Luke snarled, and I'll kill you myself. We finish this. Here. Now. The sun touched the horizon, painting the street in shades of blood and gold. A warm wind stirred the dust, carrying with it the memory of 17 years of peace about to end. In windows up and down the street, faces appeared and disappeared like ghosts, the whole town watching while trying to remain unseen. Your brothers don't need to die here, Marcus said quietly. This is between you and me. Let them ride out. Like you let my friends ride out in Tucson? Luke's scarred face twisted. No, they stay. Want them to see the great El Coyote fall. Want them to tell the story of how Luke Hawkins outdraws the legend. Marcus nodded slowly, as if he'd expected nothing else. Then let's be clear about the rules, no shooting from the sides. He looked at the brothers. You draw on me, you die first. This is your brother's fight. Let him have it clean. The redhead swallowed hard. Luke. Do as he says, Luke ordered, his left hand rock steady on his gun. El Coyote wants a proper duel. We'll give him one. One last taste of the old ways before I send him to hell. Sarah's voice carried from the doorway, thick with unshed tears. Marcus, please, this isn't you anymore. You don't have to do this. Sorry, Sarah, Marcus replied without turning. Sometimes a man has to be who he really is, not who he's pretending to be. His voice softened slightly. Go inside now. Check on your father. Remember me as I was, not as what's about to happen. The sun slipped lower, the shadows growing longer, stretched like truth across the packed earth of the street. The wind had died completely, leaving the air heavy with anticipation. Even the ever-present sound of crickets had gone silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Anytime you're ready, old man, Luke called out, shifting his weight slightly. Been waiting 17 years for this, don't want to wait another minute. Marcus stood perfectly still, his hands still loose at his sides. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the silent street, to every window where worried faces watched, to every heart that beat in fearful anticipation. 17 years ago, he said slowly, I walked away from this life because I was tired of counting the dead, tired of being the fastest, the deadliest, the most feared. Thought I could bury El Coyote under years of peaceful living. His eyes met Luke's across the 20 paces that separated them. But some things don't stay buried. Some debts have to be paid. And some men have to be who they are no matter how hard they try to be something else. The grandfather clock in the saloon began to strike the hour. its chimes rolling out across the silent street like thunder. With each sound, the sun slipped a little lower, the shadows grew a little longer, and two men faced each other across 20 paces of dust and destiny, waiting to see which of them would live to see the stars come out. The last echoes of the grandfather clock faded into the dusty air. Marcus felt time slow down, the way it always had in moments like this. Every detail became crystal clear. The creak of leather as Luke shifted his weight, the soft whisper of wind through the empty street, the gleam of dying sunlight on gun barrels. 17 years melted away like morning frost, and the habits of a lifetime came flooding back. 20 paces. A distance he'd measured 1,000 times with his eyes, with his feet, with his life. The exact length where skill separated the living from the dead. Luke's gun was already drawn, his left-handed grip steady as stone. Marcus's Colt remained in its holster waiting, patient as death itself. "Been studying you," Luke said, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "All these years, every story, every witness account, they say you never drew first, always waited for the other man to make his move." His scarred face twisted into a smile. "That true? Or just another legend?" "Not legend," Marcus replied quietly. "Just good sense. Man who draws first is committed. Can't change his mind, can't adjust. Man who draws second knows exactly what he has to beat." The youngest Hawkins brother shifted nervously. "Luke, if he's really never lost—" "Shut up!" Luke's voice cracked like a whip. "He's just an old man now. Whatever he used to be, time catches up with everyone." But there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a shadow of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Marcus watched it all with the calm detachment that had made him legend. His mind cataloged every detail. The way Luke's weight was distributed, favoring his left side slightly. The angle of his gun, a fraction too high for optimal realignment after recoil. The tension in his brothers' faces as they watched their sibling prepare to face death. "You want to know the truth about Tucson?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the weight of long-buried memory. "Why I left you alive that day?" Luke's gun hand tightened imperceptibly. "Don't matter now." "It matters," Marcus continued, as if Luke hadn't spoken. "You were different from the others. Even then, I could see it. You weren't empty inside like Carson and his killers. You were angry. Yes, lost, certainly. But there was still something human in your eyes when that teller died. Something that flinched." "You're trying to get in my head," Luke snarled, but his voice wavered slightly. "Trying to shake my nerve." "I'm trying to give you one last chance," Marcus corrected. "Same as I did that day. Walk away, Luke. Take your brothers and ride out. Let the past stay buried where it belongs." For a moment, just a heartbeat, something flickered in Luke's eyes. Something that might have been doubt, or recognition, or even a glimmer of the boy he'd been before violence and vengeance had scarred him inside and out. But then it was gone, replaced by the hard glitter of 17 years of hate. "Too late for chances," Luke said softly. "Too late for walking away. Draw your gun, old man. Let's see if the legend lives up to the stories." Sarah's voice carried from the saloon doorway, where she stood despite Marcus's warning. "Please. Both of you. This doesn't have to happen." But Marcus knew it did. Had known it from the moment he recognized Luke's face, from the instant he'd seen that familiar mix of pain and purpose in the gunman's eyes. Some stories could only end one way, written in powder and led across the pages of history. His hands remained loose at his sides, but his senses had sharpened to a razor's edge. He could feel the weight of the Colt on his hip, the subtle patterns in the grip that Eduardo Vargas had carved by hand. Could smell gun oil and leather desert dust in the metallic tang of approaching night. Could see the subtle tells in Luke's stance that telegraphed his intentions as clearly as signal flags on a battlefield. "They say you were magic with that gun," Luke continued, his voice taking on a dreamlike quality. "Say you could read a man's mind, know when he was going to draw before he knew himself. That true? Or just more legend?" "No magic," Marcus replied. "Just Experience. Man about to draw has to shift his weight first, has to commit his body before his hand ever moves, telegraph his intentions clear as sunrise to anyone who knows how to read the signs. And you can read them? Always could. Marcus's eyes never left Luke's face. It's why I'm still alive, why all those fast young guns who came looking for my reputation ended up in Boot Hill instead. Man's body tells the truth even when his mouth is lying. The sun touched the western horizon, painting the street in shades of amber and shadow. Soon it would be too dark for this dance of death, but both men knew it wouldn't last that long. One way or another, their 17-year journey was about to end. Luke's brothers had backed away slightly, their own guns lowered, awareness finally dawning that they were watching something beyond their understanding. This wasn't just a gunfight. It was history unfolding, legend coming to life, the past reaching out with steel fingers to claim its due. "Last chance," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying the weight of every life he'd ever taken, every death he'd dealt in the name of justice or vengeance or simple survival. "Walk away. Be more than just another bullet in another grave." The wind had died completely now, leaving the air heavy with anticipation. The whole street seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when memory became murder, when legend became lead, when 17 years of peace finally shattered under the weight of a single trigger pull. Luke's face hardened, his decision written in the steel of his eyes and the set of his jaw. "Draw," he whispered, and the word carried all the force of a death sentence. Draw and die, El Coyote. Time seemed to crystallize, each second stretching like molasses in winter. Marcus watched Luke's face with the concentration of a lifetime, reading the minute changes in expression, the subtle shifts of muscle that preceded action. 17 years of peace dissolved like morning mist, replaced by the cold clarity that had once made him legend. Faster than thought, the old-timers used to say about El Coyote's draw. Faster than a rattler's strike. But it had never been about raw speed. It was about reading the signs, about seeing the future written in a man's eyes before his hand ever moved toward his gun. Luke's left hand was rock steady, his gun already drawn and aimed. To the casual observer, he had every advantage. Weapon out, target acquired, trigger a mere hair's breadth from death. But Marcus saw what others missed. The slight tension in Luke's shoulder that would slow his reaction time. The way his weight was shifted just a fraction too far forward, limiting his ability to adjust his aim. "Any last words, old man?" Luke's voice carried across the 20 paces of dust and destiny that separated them. "Any final wisdom before I send you to meet all those men you killed?" "Just a question," Marcus replied, his hands still loose at his sides. "That boy in Tucson, Billy Matthews, do you remember his face? Or has it faded like all the others?" A flicker of something, pain, guilt, memory, crossed Luke's scarred features. "Trying to shake my nerve won't work. I've waited too long for this. Not trying to shake anything," Marcus said softly. "Just wondering if you ever think about the choices that brought us here. About all the moments you could have turned aside, could have chosen a different path." Sarah's voice came from the saloon doorway, thick with fear. "Marcus, please." "Stay inside, Sarah," he called back, never taking his eyes off Luke. "This won't take long." The youngest Hawkins' brother had backed up against the hitching post, his gun hanging forgotten at his side. The redhead stood frozen, watching the scene unfold with the horrified fascination of a man witnessing an approaching tornado. 17 years, Luke said, his voice taking on an almost dreamy quality. 17 years of practice, of planning, of dreaming about this moment, about proving that El Coyote was just a man after all, just flesh and blood and bone that bullets could tear through like anyone else. "Flesh and blood," Marcus agreed. "Never claimed to be anything else. Just a man who learned to read the signs, to see the moment before it happened, to know when death was coming and step aside just fast enough to let it pass." The sun hung on the horizon like a drop of blood about to fall, Long shadows stretched across the street, turning the dust to liquid gold. In windows up and down the street, faces appeared and disappeared like ghosts hanging, unable to look away from the history unfolding before them. Sheriff Wheeler stood helplessly by, his new badge suddenly feeling like lead on his chest. This was beyond law, beyond order, beyond anything his authority could touch. This was legend coming to life, the past reaching out with steel fingers to claim its due. They say you can see it coming, Luke continued, his left hand steady as stone on his gun. Say you can read a man's intentions before he knows them himself. That true? Or just another story to scare young guns away? Marcus didn't answer immediately. His eyes had taken on a distant look, as if seeing beyond the present moment into some realm where past and future merged. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every gunfight he'd ever survived, every life he'd ever taken. Want to know the truth about speed? He asked quietly. It's not in the hand, not in the muscle or bone or sinew, it's in the mind, in the ability to see the moment before it happens, to be moving before the other man knows he's going to draw. Philosophy won't save you, Luke snarled, but there was a tremor in his voice now. Not against 17 years of practice, not against a hand that's never known anything but hate and revenge. Hate makes you fast, Marcus acknowledged, but it also makes you blind, makes you miss the small things that mean the difference between living and dying. His eyes locked onto Luke's. Like the way your weight is shifted too far forward. Like the tension in your shoulder that'll slow your trigger pull by a fraction of a second. Luke's face paled slightly, his gun hand twitching almost imperceptibly. You're trying to... Not trying anything, Marcus cut him off. Just telling you what I see. What 17 years of peace have taught me about watching, about waiting, about seeing the truth beneath the surface. The wind had died completely now, leaving the air heavy with anticipation. Even the dust seemed to hang motionless, suspended in the last rays of sunlight like memories frozen in amber. Draw, Luke whispered, the word carrying all the force of 17 years of obsession. Draw, or I'll kill you where you stand. Marcus's voice was soft as falling snow, hard as desert stone. No, son, you won't, because I can see it in your eyes. The same thing I saw in Tucson. The hesitation, the doubt, the human being still alive beneath all that hate and pain. A muscle twitched in Luke's scarred face. You don't know anything about... I know everything about you, Marcus interrupted, because I've been you. Been that angry young man with a gun and a grudge, thinking speed and hate were enough to make a life worth living. His hands remained perfectly still at his sides. But I learned better. Learned that the fastest draw isn't worth a damn if it's not backed by something more than revenge. The sun slipped lower, the shadows growing longer, stretched like truth across the packed earth of the street. In that fading light, two men faced each other across 20 paces of dust and destiny, while history held its breath and legend prepared to become reality once again. Perntient, this stray bride of the gods ran like a bowstring drawn to breaking point. In that infinite space between heartbeats, Marcus saw everything with crystal clarity. The tremor in Luke's gun hand that betrayed his uncertainty. The way his brothers had backed away from the impending violence. The last rays of sunlight painting the street in shades of blood and gold. You think you know me? Luke's voice cracked like dry timber. Think you can read my soul like you read gun hands? I know the weight you carry, Marcus replied softly. The faces that haunt your dreams. Billy Matthews, Eduardo Vargas, all the others who died because you chose the wrong path. His eyes never left Luke's face. Know it because I carried that same weight until I learned there was another way. A bead of sweat traced the scar on Luke's face. There is no other way. Not anymore. Not after 17 years. There's always another way, Marcus said. Right up until the moment you pull that trigger. Right up until you make the choice that can't be unmade. Sarah's voice carried from the saloon doorway, thick with tears. Luke, please listen to him. It's not too late to... The crack of Luke's gun cut through her words like thunder. But Marcus had seen it coming. had read it in the subtle shift of weight, in the tightening of shoulder muscles, in the desperate need to silence the truth before it could take root. He was moving before the bullet left the barrel, his body flowing like water around the path of lead. The shot echoed off the buildings, sending pigeons scattering into the darkening sky. A splinter of wood exploded from the wall behind where Marcus had been standing a heartbeat before, but the old gunfighter had already shifted, his movement so smooth it seemed almost casual, as if death itself couldn't touch him. Fast, Marcus acknowledged, his voice unchanged. But anger made you shoot wide, made you pull the trigger before you were ready. Luke's face had gone pale, his left hand adjusting his aim with desperate speed. That's impossible. Nobody's that fast. Not about speed, Marcus replied. Told you that already. It's about reading the signs, about seeing the moment before it happens. His right hand still hung loose at his side, nowhere near his holstered gun. Want me to tell you what's going to happen next? The youngest Hawkins brother's voice shook. Luke, maybe we should… Shut up! Luke's gun swung between his brother and Marcus, the movement jerky with tension. Nobody's leaving, nobody's backing down, this ends here. Marcus nodded slowly. Yes, it does. Want to know how? You're going to shoot again. 2 shots this time. Fast, but not fast enough. Your hand's already getting tired from holding that gun so long, and the doubt's creeping in. After those shots miss, you'll start to realize what everyone else figured out years ago. Speed isn't everything. Stop talking, Luke fired again, the shot going wide as Marcus seemed to flow around it like smoke in the wind. Another shot followed immediately, the bullet throwing dust from the street where the old gunfighter had been a fraction of a second before. Just like I said, Marcus continued, his voice still calm, still measured. 2 shots, both missing because anger and fear are riding your hand. Want to know what happens next? Luke's gun hand was trembling now, his face sheened with sweat despite the cooling air. You're not human. Can't be. Human as they come, Marcus replied. Just old enough to have learned that most gunfights are won or lost before the first shot's fired. Won or lost in the mind, in the heart, in the ability to see truth instead of what you want to believe. The red-headed brother had backed all the way to the hitching post, his own gun forgotten at his side. The youngest had gone pale as paper, watching legend come to life before his eyes. Sheriff Wheeler stood frozen, his hand nowhere near his gun, understanding that he was witnessing something beyond his authority to control. Next, Marcus continued, as if discussing the weather, you're going to realize that your left hand's starting to cramp. 17 years of practice are good, but muscles don't lie. The tension's building in your shoulder, making your aim less certain, making you wonder if everything you've believed about this moment was wrong. Stop it! Luke fired again, the shot wild, desperate. Stop talking and draw. Fight me like a man. Like a man? Marcus's voice carried a hint of sadness. What kind of man spends 17 years feeding his hate instead of healing his wounds? What kind of man lets one moment of violence poison his whole life? The sun hung on the horizon like a dying ember, painting long shadows across the street. In those shadows, 2 men faced each other across 20 paces of dust and destiny. One desperate and afraid despite his drawn gun, the other calm and still despite the bullets that seemed unable to touch him. You want to know what happens last? Marcus asked softly. Want to know how this story ends? Luke's face was a mask of conflicting emotions, hate and fear, doubt and desperation. Just draw. Please. Give me the fight I've waited for. No. Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. Because this isn't about fighting. Never was. This is about choosing. About seeing the moment when you can finally let go of the past and walk a different path. The weight of 17 years seemed to press down on the street like a physical thing. In windows up and down the boardwalk, faces watched in silent witness as legend and reality merged in the dying light of day. Last chance, Marcus said quietly. Walk away. Be more than just another bullet in another grave. Be the man you could have been if hate hadn't stolen your choices. The street had grown silent as a grave, the only sound the ragged breathing of Luke Hawkins as he struggled with the weight of truth and memory. His left hand trembled slightly on his gun, the tremor growing more pronounced with each passing second. 5 shots fired, 5 shots missed, and El Coyote hadn't even touched his weapon. "You're playing with me," Luke snarled, but fear had crept into his voice, replacing the certainty of moments before. "Dancing around like some kind of devil." "No devil," Marcus replied calmly. "Just a man who's learned to read the signs. Your next shot will go wide right. You're compensating too much for the left-hand draw now. After that, you've got 1 bullet left. One last chance to prove something that stopped mattering 17 years ago." As if compelled by the words, Luke fired again. The bullet kicked up dust to Marcus's right, exactly where the old gunfighter had said it would go. The youngest Hawkins brother made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. "How?" Luke's voice cracked. "How can you know?" "Because I've been where you are," Marcus said softly. "Young, angry, thinking speed and hate were enough to build a life on. Thinking that if you could just kill the right person, hurt the right target, somehow all the pain inside would make sense." Sarah had moved to the edge of the boardwalk, her hands pressed against her mouth. She'd known Marcus for years, thought she'd known everything about him. But this was something else, not just skill with a gun, but a deep understanding of the human heart that made violence almost unnecessary. "1 bullet left," Marcus continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent street. "One last choice to make. You can use it to try to kill me, knowing in your heart it won't work. Or you can choose something else. Something harder than pulling a trigger." Luke's scarred face was a battlefield of emotions. Hate warring with doubt, vengeance grappling with the first glimmers of understanding. 17 years, he whispered. 17 years of planning, of practice, of living for this moment. "And what has it gotten you?" Marcus asked gently. "A crooked hand, a scarred face, and a heart so full of hate it can barely beat? Is that worth 17 years of your life?" The red-headed brother spoke up, his voice shaking. "Luke, maybe he's right. Maybe it's time to—" "Shut up." Luke's gun swung wildly between his brother and Marcus, the movement desperate and uncertain. "All of you shut up. This isn't how it's supposed to go. You're supposed to draw. Supposed to give me my chance at revenge." "Revenge," Marcus echoed, the word heavy with meaning. "Ever wonder why I left you alive that day in Tucson? Why did I shot your gun hand instead of your heart?" "Because you wanted me to suffer," Luke spat. "Wanted me to live with shame." "No." Marcus's voice was soft but carried the weight of absolute truth. "Because I saw something in your eyes when Billy Matthews died. Saw the horror, the regret, the human being still alive under all that hate. Saw a young man who might still choose a different path if someone gave him the chance." The sun had slipped halfway below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Long shadows stretched across the street like bars of judgment, while history held its breath and waited for one man's choice to write its final chapter. "Your last bullet," Marcus said quietly. "Use it to kill me if you can, or use it to kill the hate that's been eating you alive for 17 years. Your choice." Luke's gun hand trembled violently now, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his scarred face. "I don't know how," he whispered. "Don't know how to be anything else anymore." "Yes, you do." Marcus took a step forward, then another, his movements slow and deliberate. "The same way I did. One choice at a time. One day at a time. Starting with this moment. Right here." Sheriff Wheeler watched in amazement as Marcus walked steadily toward Luke, making no move toward his own weapon. The setting sun caught the silver in his hair, the lines in his face, painting him in colors of wisdom and time. 17 years ago, Marcus continued, his voice gentle as falling snow, "I gave you a chance to choose a different path. You weren't ready then. The hate was too fresh, the pain too deep. But time changes things, changes people. If they let it. He was 10 paces away now, then 8, then 6. Luke's gun followed his movement, the barrel weaving like a snake about to strike, but something had changed in the younger man's eyes. Something was cracking, breaking like ice in spring. Can't take back what happened in Tucson, Marcus said. Can't undo the choices that brought us here. But we can choose what happens next. Both of us. Right here. Right now. 5 paces separated them now. Luke's brothers watched in stunned silence as the legend they'd heard about all their lives walked calmly toward a loaded gun, armed with nothing but truth and time. Your choice, son, Marcus said softly. That last bullet can start another 17 years of hate, or it can end them. Right here. Today. 4 paces. 3. The entire street seemed to hold its breath, watching the space between an angry man with 1 bullet and a peaceful man with unshakable calm. In that space hung 17 years of pain, of practice, of purpose about to be tested against a truth as old as time itself. Choose, Marcus whispered, close enough now to reach out and touch the trembling gun if he wanted. Choose who you're going to be for the next 17 years. Time seemed to stop in the dying light of day. Luke Hawkins stood with his gun hand trembling, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on his face, while Marcus waited just 3 paces away. The last bullet hung between them like a question waiting to be answered, like a choice waiting to be made. I see them, Luke whispered, his voice cracking. Every night in my dreams. Billy Matthews, Eduardo Vargas, all of them. Thought if I killed you, they'd finally leave me alone. They never leave you alone, Marcus replied softly. Not really. Best you can do is learn to live with them. Learn from them. Let their memories guide you toward something better than what you were. The sun had almost disappeared now, painting the western sky in flames while darkness crept up from the east. In that half-light, the street of Silverpine had become a stage where the past and present grappled for control of the future. 17 years, Luke said, the words carrying all the weight of a life misspent. 17 years of practice, of planning, of dreaming about this moment. And now, his gun hand trembled violently. Now I don't even know if I can pull the trigger. Because you're not the same man who rode with Carson's gang, Marcus said. Not the same angry boy I spared in Tucson. Time changes things, changes people, if they let it. Sarah watched from the boardwalk, her heart in her throat, as the 2 men stood almost close enough to touch. The Marcus she knew, quiet, gentle, always ready with a kind word, had merged with the legend of El Coyote, creating something entirely new, something that fought with wisdom instead of bullets. How did you do it? Luke asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How did you walk away from being El Coyote, from all that power, that reputation? 1 day at a time, Marcus replied. 1 choice at a time. Started with burying my gun belt and choosing to be something different, something more than just a fast hand and a deadly reputation. The youngest Hawkins brother had holstered his gun, watching the scene with a mixture of awe and confusion. The redhead stood frozen, unable to look away from the moment when legend and reality merged into something neither of them had expected. But the guilt, Luke pressed, his scarred face twisted with pain. The memories, the weight of all those deaths. Stays with you? Marcus acknowledged. But it changes. Becomes something you carry instead of something that carries you. Becomes a reason to do better, to be better, instead of an excuse for more violence. Sheriff Wheeler stood to the side, his badge catching the last light of day. He'd taken the job because nobody else wanted it, thinking he'd never face anything more dangerous than drunk cowboys on Saturday night. Now he was watching something beyond law, beyond authority, watching redemption being offered with empty hands and quiet words. That last bullet, Marcus continued, his voice gentle but carrying to every corner of the silent street. It's not just lead and powder. It's 17 years of your life, 17 years of hate and pain and practice, all wrapped up in one piece of brass. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Luke's gun hand shook so badly now he could barely keep it pointed. I can't. Yes, you can. Marcus took another step forward, close enough now that the gun barrel nearly touched his chest. Same choice I made 17 years ago. Same choice every man has to make sooner or later? Who are you going to be? What kind of story are you going to write with the years you have left? The street had grown so quiet they could hear the soft creak of leather as Luke's brother shifted nervously, the whisper of wind through the empty buildings, the distant call of a mourning dove welcoming the approaching night. Remember what you felt in Tucson? Marcus asked softly. When Billy Matthews died, that sick feeling in your gut, that voice in your head saying this isn't right? That was the real you. The man you could have been if Carson's gang hadn't found you first. That man's still in there, under all that hate and pain, still waiting for his chance. Luke's face crumpled like paper in fire. How? He whispered. How do I find him again? Start by putting down the gun, Marcus said gently. Start by choosing something different, something harder than revenge but better than hate. For a moment that stretched like years, nothing moved in the street of Silver Pine. The sun had vanished completely now, leaving only a faint glow in the western sky. In that glow, two men stood face to face, one with a trembling gun, one with empty hands and quiet truth. Then, slowly, like ice breaking up in spring, Luke's gun hand began to lower. The barrel dipped toward the ground, wavered there a moment, then dropped completely. The sound of the gun hitting the dirt seemed to echo off every building, marking the end of one story and the beginning of another. Luke's legs gave out and he sank to his knees, 17 years of purpose draining away like water through sand. His brothers started forward, but Marcus waved them back with a small gesture. This moment belonged to Luke alone. This choice, this ending, this new beginning. 17 years, Luke whispered to the gathering dark. 17 years wasted. Marcus knelt beside him, his movements slow and careful. Not wasted, he said quietly. Just spent learning a lesson that took me just as long to learn. The hardest battles aren't won with guns. They're won with the choice to put the gun down and walk a different path. Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear in the deepening purple of the sky. Time had started moving again in Silver Pine, bringing with it the possibility of change, of redemption, of choices yet to be made. Night had settled over Silver Pine like a gentle hand, drawing a curtain across the day. Stars emerged one by one, watching over the street where legend and redemption had tangled and transformed. Sarah had lit the lamps in the saloon, their warm glow spilling out onto the boardwalk where Marcus and Luke still knelt in the cooling dust. What happens now? Luke asked, his voice rough with spent emotion. The tears had dried on his scarred face, leaving tracks that caught the lamplight like silver trails. How do you start over after 17 years of living for the wrong thing? Marcus stood slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. Same way you start over after any mistake. One step at a time, one day at a time, one choice at a time. He held out his hand to the younger man, starting with standing up. Luke stared at the offered hand for a long moment, as if it were something foreign and strange. Then, slowly, he reached up with his right hand, the one Marcus had shot in Tucson, the one that bore the scar of their first meeting, and took it. The gesture carried the weight of years, of choices, of paths diverging and converging again. The youngest Hawkins brother stepped forward, his face a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Luke, what do you want us to do? Go get the horses, Luke said quietly, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. But not to ride out, not yet. Think maybe we all need to talk. Need to understand some things. Sarah emerged from the saloon carrying a tray with coffee cups, her movements careful in the gathering dark. Maybe you could all come inside? It's getting cold out here, and... She glanced at Marcus, seeking permission to extend hospitality to men who'd threatened violence minutes before. Marcus nodded, a slight smile touching his weathered face. Coffee sounds good, been a long day. He turned to Sheriff Wheeler, who still stood uncertainly at the edge of the boardwalk. Sheriff, would you join us? Think maybe it's time for some truths to be shared. Wheeler touched his badge self-consciously. Are you sure that's wise? These men are at a crossroads, Marcus finished for him. Same as I was, 17 years ago. Same as every man who has to choose between what he's been and what he could be. He gestured toward the saloon door. Sometimes the law needs to understand the story behind the crime. Makes it easier to recognize real change when it happens. The red-headed brother had retrieved Luke's fallen gun, holding it awkwardly. What about this? Give it to the sheriff, Luke said, his voice carrying the weariness of 17 years suddenly lifted. Don't think I'll be needing it anymore. Not for a while, anyway. Inside the saloon, Sarah busied herself lighting more lamps while the men settled around a large table. The familiar space seemed different now, transformed by what had happened in the street outside. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, marking time's passage in a world that had shifted on its axis. I think, Marcus said, accepting a cup of coffee from Sarah, it's time you boys heard the whole story. About Tucson, about why I walked away, about what happens when a man realizes his reputation for being the fastest gun alive is really just another kind of prison. Luke cradled his coffee cup in hands that had stopped shaking, though his face still showed the strain of recent emotion. And about Billy Matthews? About all of them? About all of them, Marcus agreed. Their stories deserve to be told, deserve to be remembered for more than just being notches on a gun belt or names in a newspaper. Sheriff Wheeler pulled up a chair, his initial uncertainty giving way to genuine interest. I'd like to hear that story too, if you're willing to tell it. Been a sheriff here for 3 years. Never knew... He gestured vaguely. Any of this. That was the point. Marcus smiled slightly. 17 years ago, I buried El Coyote as deep as I could. Buried the gun belt, the reputation, the man I'd been. Thought if I lived quiet enough, peaceful enough, maybe that part of my life would stay buried. He glanced at Luke. But some things don't stay buried. Some debts have to be faced one way or another. Sarah brought more coffee and a plate of biscuits, then settled into a chair beside Marcus. The warm lamplight caught the silver in his hair, the lines in his face, painting him in shades of wisdom earned through hard experience. Start with Tucson, Luke said softly. Start with the day everything changed. For both of us. Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes distant with memory. Tucson, he agreed. Summer of '82. Hot enough to make the devils themselves seek shade. Carson's gang had been raiding up and down the territory for months, leaving a trail of bodies and burning buildings. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, watching as truth and memory unwound like thread from a spool. In the street, the dust had settled where legend and redemption had danced their deadly waltz. And in the warm light of McKinney's saloon, 6 men and a young woman gathered to hear a story about choices, about consequences, about the long road from who we are to who we might become. Dawn came to Silver Pine like a painter washing the world in gentle colors. The night had passed in a flow of stories and revelations, of truths long buried finally seeing light. Now, as the first rays of sun touched the eastern hills, Marcus stood on the boardwalk outside McKinney's saloon, watching the town come slowly to life. Luke Hawkins emerged from the saloon, squinting at the morning light. The scar on his face caught the sun differently now, somehow less harsh than it had seemed the day before. 17 years of hate and purpose had drained from his shoulders, leaving him looking younger despite the sleepless night. Your brothers are still sleeping? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. The youngest Hawkins had dozed off during the night's long conversation, while the redhead had finally succumbed to exhaustion just before dawn. Yeah, Luke nodded, coming to stand beside the older man. First peaceful sleep they've had in years, I expect. Been driving them hard these last months, hunting for you. He paused, considering his next words carefully. Hunting for something I thought I needed. Marcus smiled slightly. And now? Now. Luke shook his head slowly. Now I understand why you walked away. Why you buried El Coyote and chose to become something else. After hearing about all of it, the weight you carried, the choices you made, the path you found, he gestured at the peaceful street. This means something different now. Sarah appeared in the saloon doorway, carrying fresh coffee. The night's vigil had left shadows under her eyes, but her face carried a new understanding as she looked at Marcus. Breakfast will be ready soon, she said softly. Father's asking for you both. The mention of her father brought a shadow of guilt to Luke's face. Still can't believe he was there that day in Tucson, working as a deputy, trying to stop us. If I'd known. You couldn't have known, Marcus replied. Same as he couldn't have known that 17 years later, his daughter would be serving coffee to the man who shot him in the leg during that robbery. He turned to face Luke fully. That's why I told you both last night, why some truths need to come out, need to be faced. Only way to move forward. Sheriff Wheeler approached from the direction of his office, his boots raising small puffs of dust in the morning light. He'd left shortly after midnight to make his rounds, promising to return. Now he carried a bundle wrapped in old canvas. Found these in the jail, he said, holding out the package. Figure they might help with what you were talking about last night. About making amends. Luke unwrapped the bundle carefully, revealing 3 well-worn wanted posters. His own face stared back at him along with his brothers from the days when they'd first started making a name for themselves. The rewards offered seemed like relics from another life. Got word from the territorial marshal last night, Wheeler continued. Told him about what happened here, about the choice you made. He shifted uncomfortably. He's willing to consider a deal. Testimony about the remaining members of Carson's gang in exchange for clemency. Said something about 17 years being long enough. Luke's hands trembled slightly as he rewrapped the posters. And my brothers? They were never wanted for anything serious, Wheeler replied. Mostly just riding with you. They help with the testimony, they walk away clean. Marcus watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. Justice takes different forms, he said softly. Sometimes it's punishment. Sometimes it's a chance to make things right. The sun had climbed higher now, painting Silver Pine in shades of promise. From inside the saloon came the sounds of Sarah preparing breakfast, of her father's wheelchair moving across the floorboards, of Luke's brothers stirring from their sleep. The ordinary sounds of life continuing, of the world turning toward something new. What will you do now? Luke asked, turning to Marcus. Now that everyone knows who you were, who you are. Marcus considered the question, watching as the town's other residents began emerging from their homes. They moved differently now, casting glances toward the saloon where legend had transformed into redemption the night before. Same thing I've done for 17 years, he replied finally. Fix machinery at the mill, play chess with Doc Wallace on Sundays, try to be the kind of man who deserves the peace he's found. He smiled slightly. Only difference is now I won't have to pretend the weight isn't there. Won't have to hide the lessons I learned from carrying it. Luke nodded slowly, understanding. And me? How do I start building something new after 17 years of tearing things down? One day at a time, Marcus said, echoing his words from the night before. One choice at a time. Starting with breakfast, I expect. He gestured toward the saloon door. Sarah's father has something he wants to say to you. About Tucson. About forgiveness. About the kind of strength it takes to let go of the past without forgetting its lessons. The morning breeze carried the smell of coffee and cooking, of dust and sage, of a town waking up to find itself somehow different than it had been the day before. In windows up and down the street, faces appeared and disappeared, watching the two men who stood in the growing light, one who had buried his legend and found peace, one who had finally laid down his hate and chosen a different path. 17 years, Luke mused, touching the scar on his face gently. Feels like waking up from a long nightmare. No, Marcus corrected him kindly. Feels like finally being awake. Finally being ready to see the world as it is, not as hate painted it. He gestured toward the saloon door. Come on, breakfast waiting. And after that? After that, there's a whole lot of road ahead. For all of us. They turned together toward the warm light spilling from the saloon doorway. Behind them, the sun climbed higher over Silverpine, painting the world in colors of redemption and possibility, while the grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, marking time's passage toward whatever stories waited to be written next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.